nobility is always about representation. And even in monarchies like Britain, the king is basically a symbolic figure without real political power. But the symbolic power of these people is remarkable and is important even today. And of course, it would have been important in the 1920s, 30s, 40s, only that there is no symbolical counterpower by the Hohenzollern family. And I think this is the only thing, you cannot ask this family to be social democrat or socialist or be, I don't know, friendly with the communists, but one could have expected this family or any member of the family to represent this kind of symbolic counterpower against the Nazis. And this is a thing that I was surprised to find out because I have been working about the nobility. I did this for 20 years, but I was astonished with the extent to which there was nothing. There was not a single figure, not a single sentence, not a single symbolical gesture, not a single day where this kind of symbolical counterpower against the Nazis would have been produced. And I think this is remarkable.
Hello. On the 9th of November 1918, Kaiser Wilhelm II abdicated the German crown and retired to Holland, where he learnt Dutch and began a passion for archaeology. But during the rise of the Nazis, hope was raised that he could once more stride the imperial stage arm in arm with Adolf Hitler. These hopes were taken on by his son, the Crown Prince, but these too were dashed, and then began an attempt to cleanse the Hohenzollern name, a name that has evoked figures such as the Great Elector, Frederick William I, and Frederick the Great. Joining today is the acclaimed historian Stephan Malinowski, the author of The Hohenzollerns and the Nazis, as we discuss the German royal family's opportunities or opportunistic attempts during the rise of the Third Reich, their involvement or lack of in the resistance, life after the war, and what the Hohenzollern name means in Germany today. If you can see to giving a review, 5 stars are great, and any constructive feedback please do send to me, history@aspectsofhistory.com. There's plenty more great history on the way, including the Vietnam War and the causes of the Wars of the Roses. But until then, it's me and Stephan Malinowski talking the Nazis and the German royal family. Stephan, this is a great pleasure to have you on. Thank you very much. We're here to talk about your new book, The Hohenzollerns and the Nazis, A History of Collaboration. But thank you for joining me.
Thank you for having me, and I'm happy to talk to you.
Great. Well, I think the subtitle, A History of Collaboration, does slightly clear up any listener who thinks there may be some confusion over the role of the Hohenzollerns. And I wanted to ask you first, actually, was the whole genesis of the book what I suspect you deal with in the introduction, which is this investigation that was carried out a number of years ago between sort of two sets of very distinguished historians, and tell me if I'm getting this wrong, two sets of very distinguished historians really to discover the role of the Hohenzollerns, one group suspecting that they were collaborating, headed by yourself, I think, and then another that were not convinced that they were collaborating. Is that correct?
That's roughly correct. I think the fact of collaboration itself was not really in doubt. What was in doubt, and what partly for these people, for the other side of historians, is still in doubt, is the importance of the collaboration. So this goes back to actually the year 2014, and in very short, this goes back to the Soviets. When the Soviets take Germany in 1945, and one of the first things they were doing was expropriating certain families of the German aristocracy, industrialists, etc., among them the Hohenzollern family, which was expropriated in 1945. And at the moment of German reunification in 1990, the possibility of asking for indemnation for this expropriation was created by the legislators, and the Hohenzollern family, as many other families in Germany, put in a claim for being recompensated for these expropriations. And this somehow triggered a new discussion and brought the Hohenzollern family, which was somehow forgotten by history, if you will, like the Ring and Tolkien, back to the German present. Because the legislation in 1994 issued a law saying that if the last owner of a given property supported the Nazis in an important way, he or she would be excluded from any indemnation. And this was the question, if or if not the German crown prince, or the last crown prince, that is the oldest son of Kaiser Wilhelm II, supported the Nazis in an important way or not. And this was the debate which was triggered basically in the 1990s and which became, a public discussion around 2000 and basically 2019. And in this context, I was asked by the German, actually the Ministry of Finance in Potsdam, in Brandenburg, to write an expert opinion about this question, because I had been working on the question of the German nobility and the Nazis before then. And so this led to a clash or a discussion between several groups of historians.
Fascinating stuff. So just for the benefit of some listeners, the Hohenzollerns are, this is the predominant royal family for Germany. But, you know, the family goes back a long way. And I just wondered if you could just give a little bit of background as to who the Hohenzollerns were.
Well, an easy way to put it is one of the most important and powerful families of the European high nobility and of the German high nobility, which provided Germany, a dynasty which provided Germany for a long time with electors and princes, basically coming in the 11th century from the south of the country, from Franconia, and then based in Prussia, and since 1701, providing Prussia with the first king when they become kings, and more importantly, and most importantly, providing the German Empire with the three emperors that ruled the German Empire. So this is the period between 1871 and the end of the First World War in November 1918, which is the downfall of the German Empire and the downfall of the Hohenzollern family. And the last Kaiser William II, who is a grandson of Queen Victoria. So they were close ties actually to the British monarchy.
Yes, indeed. Now, Kaiser Wilhelm II is this sort of rather, throughout his life actually, is rather a pathetic figure, it's probably fair to say, in that you mentioned that he's a grandson of Victoria. It's sort of always constantly trying to get one over on his British cousins. But the Wilhelm who is sort of rather desperate to get in with the Nazis in the early part of your book. And I know your book deals with his son, the Crown Prince, more significantly, but I just wanted to explore Wilhelm himself, because is it fair to say that Hitler sort of led him on, making him think that there was a route back to the crown whilst he was in exile in Holland, but really had no intention of ever carrying through on that?
Yeah, it's probably fair to say this, and you can somehow frame the entire history as a history of mutual misunderstanding. And there's certainly a misunderstanding from the side of the Hohenzollerns, and this goes for the ex-Kaiser. So for William, the problem with this family is that everybody's called Wilhelm. So William II, the ex-Kaiser, and his oldest son, Wilhelm, the crown prince, or the former crown prince, both of them in different ways are hoping that there might be a way to get back to power, to go back to the throne, by using the Nazi movement as a tool for their own means. And this is a combination of overestimating their own importance and power and underestimating the brutality and the new style of fascism or of German National Socialism at the time. There was probably never really a plan of the Nazis to put the Hohenzollern back on the throne, though this might be debatable for the younger Hitler. So Hitler in his younger career, when he defines himself not yet as the almighty Führer that he becomes later and after 1933. So if you look, let's say, at the time around 27, 28, 28, when Hitler is not yet the Hitler that he is going to be later, there might be this is what, by the way, for a part of the Nazi movement is true. There were monarchists within the Nazi movement. It's a minority, but it's an important minority. And these people might have been thinking, or were thinking, there might be a model where a Hohenzollern prince comes back to the throne, and where a fascist leader becomes the chancellor or the political leader of whatever kind of model. And of course, you have to look at Italy in order to understand this model, because in Italy, after 1922-24, with Italian fascism. You have a king on the throne and Mussolini so this was a very, if you will, a very successful model, and a model where the entire continental European leaders were looking at and saying this might be a model for ourselves. So before Hitler understands that he does no longer need the Hohenzollerns, and that they were, if you will, to speak with Lenin, the useful idiots, which are serving the purposes of the Nazis. There might have been a time where, and again, the term collaboration seems the right one to me here, where this form of working together seemed possible and was put into question by the Nazis.
It's interesting that, because it's so clearly self-interest driving the Hohenzollern family here, in that, you know, they would have probably gone, well, you tell me, would they have gone with a less extreme form of government if it meant they'd get the crown back?
That's one of the conservative myths, and that's one of the forms of course, counterfactual history. We don't know if what would have happened, yes. But it's an interesting thought. And it's a thought which, by the way, also played a role with British observers, most famously with Winston Churchill, who at several points after 45 was saying, had the Hohenzollern still be in place, then Hitler would never have been able to fill this vacuum, which I think there's one thing which is right in this thought, that there was indeed a vacuum created by the fall of the Kaiser, and by the Kaiser not even seeking a heroic death at the battlefield, which some of the noble officers were somehow hoping that he was going to seek for, and he didn't. So fleeing into Dutch exile, and the Crown Prince doing the same thing 2 days later. It's a very unheroic downfall of this powerful monarchy and dynasty. The idea that had Germany been a constitutional monarchy, or a monarchy with a monarch and with Hitler under that, we don't know. The point being is that with these leaders, with the material, the problem with the monarchy is that you have to work with the material that you have. You cannot go into a monarchy supermarket and choose the best leader. You have to pick the guys which are in line, and the two guys standing in line, or the entire family being there, did not provide any political able leader to come up with such a more moderate model. But of course, this is if you will, the conservative reading of German history is they say, oh, look at Britain and look at the constitutional monarchies in Europe, the Netherlands, or I don't know, Belgium or Scandinavia. All of these countries have monarchs, and none of these countries have turned into fascism. So this means that if you have a monarch, so only that Germany was not Britain, and Germany didn't have the English tradition of the king and parliament, etc. And there was no long parliament. And this is English history, and it's Scandinavian history, and German history was very, very different. And the problem, unfortunately, was that the two main leaders, so the ex-Kaiser and the ex-Crown Prince, were both trying to find ways not with the German democracy, not with the German democratic powers in charge, but finding ways in collaboration with the Nazi Party.
The Nazis were, a lot of the movement is from the streets, wasn't it? A lot of their activity was on the streets. Was it surely unrealistic for the Hohenzollerns to ever think that they could have got in with a group who probably, if we get down to it, the Nazis would have viewed the monarchy with contempt?
Yes, they did. And this is, of course, the attitude that which is typical everywhere in the European nobility, and very much in the Prussian nobility, looking down, in quotes, looking down at the street and at the proletarians, and looking down at Hitler with his strange haircut and his strange beard and his strange ways of talking, crypto Austrian accent, and being unduly dressed with strange shoes and a strange coat, and being unacceptable, actually. But then looking, this is basically a general problem for the nobility in Europe, and also for monarchs. You have to somehow find a leader that brings a part of the people to yourself, where they can't do. Hitler was the man of having street cred. He was the man who at least styled himself of being an ex-worker, and of, most importantly, having shared the fate of millions of soldiers in the trenches. and having been decorated with the Iron Cross and having been a brave soldier fighting in the trenches, unlike the Prussian princes, unlike the Kaiser, these people were in command and they were somehow standing behind the front lines. Hitler was the man who was standing in the trenches and had been fighting in the trenches, and came up with the style of being crypto close to the people. And I think this form of, which is basically, I think, typical for right-wing fascist and popular right-wing movements up to the present, by the way, to build this imagined bridge between a leader and the people. The crown prince was not really able to do this. Hitler was able to do this. So yes, there is a kind of tension which is very difficult to resolve for the crown prince or for the entire Hohenzollern family, of being close to the people. And this is basically what they were hoping that the Nazis were doing for them, of bringing a part of the German working class, the peasants, the lower middle class, the school teachers or the secretaries or the shopkeepers closer to the monarchy, or to bringing them back to the monarchy. There were, of course, millions of people who had some remaining sympathies and nostalgia or whatever kind of emotional feelings with the monarchy, which is still there. And I think this is an important point, even if the man is ridiculous. And I think that particularly the crown prince was a pathetic figure. But then the history of European monarchies is full of pathetic figures. And I was sometimes, having taught in Scotland for a long time and being familiar with Charles Edward Stuart, with the so-called Bonnie Prince Charlie, the eternal young pretender in the 18th century, which ends his life somewhere between Florence and Rome as an alcoholic, with a lot of mistresses, but still he felt the hearts and minds of millions of people in Scotland, and still today is a very prominent or popular figure. So I think what the person itself does is one thing, and then what he is symbolizing, in this case, the Scottish king or the pretender, the Catholic pretender, and of course, the Hohenzollern prince representing the splendor and the good old times of the monarchy. Even if the man was pathetic, he is also, and this is the main model of any nobility, may it be British or English or German or European, he is just a piece in a long chain. So he is going to be followed by someone. So perhaps his son or the son of the son is going to be better than him, but it is important to guarantee the line of monarchy. And coming back to the throne is not an absurd idea. I mean, the British history is full of it, and European history is full of it. And the French Revolution is filled by restoration and is filled by, the two brothers of Louis XVI is decaptured or killed by the French revolutionaries in 1793, but his two younger brothers come back from exile and come back to the throne. So this is not it's not an absurd idea, and this is what people have in mind as models to follow potentially.
I suppose, particularly with predecessors such as the Great Elector, Frederick the Great. I mean, you have two monarchs there who are de grosse, so that's going to be an extraordinarily powerful pull, presumably, for many Germans.
Yes, I mean, of course, the Frederick the Great, Friedrich der Große, but I think the entire idea of the Prussian splendor and the power of the Prussian state and the splendor of the Kaiserreich. And I mean, I was saying that William II is ridiculous. He's not ridiculous in the minds of millions of people. He's a very interesting animal in his time, and he's an extremely modern, extremely popular leader. I always keep on talking about my own grandmother, Martha, who was born in 1900 and who was German Kreuzberg, Berlin working class stock. And one of the scenes that she always told me when I was a boy or I started studying history, she died very old, was that in 1914, at the beginning of the First World War, she was standing with her older sister at Unter den Linden in Berlin and looking at the Kaiser and the splendor of the soldiers and of the officers on the horses. And she was then beaten up by her social democratic socialist father, who thought it was a scandal that his daughters were watching the Kaiser and cheering for the Prussian monarch. So, and this lady, when she was dying in her late 90s, she was still speaking of the Kaiser. So the Kaiser was popular long after he was long after he was gone, and represented for larger parts of the German society the good old times, better times. And even in the Weimar Republic, this is the case, which is, of course, less the case despite my grandmother, in the socialist milieu or in the communist milieu, but in the conservative milieu, in the German bourgeoisie, in the middle classes, the Kaiser, Prussia, the empire was extremely prominent or popular, particularly when compared with this shivering and shaking Weimar Republic, which was a very unloved system the time between the wars in Germany.
Is there a moment, and I was thinking maybe 1932, when the Crown Prince endorses Adolf Hitler in a failed bid for the presidency? Is that a moment where really that's any sort of hope that the Hohenzollerns had? Because I think he's pretty much ignored. Is that the moment where the Crown Prince understands or suspects the Hohenzollerns it's not happening, they're not going to get in with the Nazis?
No, I feared it's much later that he really understands, so that the time when the entire family, I think, starts to understand that the game was over, and that the imagined idea of horse and rider is the opposite of what they are imagining. So they are not the rider, but they are rather the horse, and it's the Nazi movement which is the rider on them and dominating them. So this moment in April 1932, this is the second round of the presidential election, where the Crown Prince is trying to negotiate a deal with Hitler, in the sense that the Crown Prince would become the Reichspräsident and he would make Hitler his Reichschancellor. And the idea is to invent some kind of a model, which again, as I said, is the Italian model. So you would combine a somehow monarch with a right-wing or fascist leader. And this fails because his daddy, so the Kaiser in his Dutch exile, prohibits his son to go this way, and the son accepts it, which is also interesting because he's a man in his 50s and his father is in exile. So he could have taken another decision, but he doesn't. So this is this moment between 31, 32, and long between and 33. So even after the so-called seizure of power, there is still hope that somehow a kind of model sharing power would be possible. And what we know about the 30s of January 33, so the day when Hitler is appointed Reichschancellor in Germany, the Crown Prince is enthusiastic about it, and he writes an enthusiastic letter to his father and says, "I've been supporting this movement for years, and it's a wonderful future, etc., etc." So at this moment in 33, everybody is enthusiastic about it. The moment where the family, where the Crown Prince, where the Kaiser, and where others are really understanding that things are turning against them is later, is in 34, basically.
Hello, Ollie here. Please forgive my interruption, but I wanted to let you know that at Aspects of History, we produce a digital magazine featuring articles, interviews, short stories and book reviews of the best historical writing available. Authors featured including Ben Macintyre, Lucy Worsley, Andrew Roberts and plenty more. An annual subscription is available for only $9.99, that's pounds or dollars. Yep, you heard that right. That's 6 issues for under £10 or dollars. Head over to aspectsofhistory.com to subscribe, where you can also gift subscriptions. Now back to the show. I was very interested in reading about is the July plot. And this is a moment where I think the aristocracy of Germany has attempted after the plot to present itself as the sort of freedom fighters of Germany and, tragic ending and all that. But we've had historians on this podcast talking about how the regime that would have been put in place of the Nazis would not have become a sort of nice liberal democracy that we could all get behind. It really wanted to keep the lands it had gained and wasn't particularly conducive to Western democracies. But the Hohenzollerns have certainly tried to put themselves at the center of this plot. And really, it's so interesting to read. I'd assumed that there was some kind of vague connection. A few of them would have got involved in smoke-filled rooms, talking about what would have happened, but there wasn't even involvement at that level, was there? The Hohenzollerns are sort of barely involved. They might have heard about it, but that's about it.
That's about it, and it's different from what one could expect because this is basically the bomb plot and the entire conjuration led by Stauffenberg. Stauffenberg and his brothers, by the way, being from the Catholic South German aristocracy, nobility, so quite far from, but still they're officers in the officer corps, and the entire thing coming from a conservative right-wing side. One could expect that these people were somehow banking on the Hohenzollerns, because if you kill a dictator, and this goes back to the Greek and Roman history, anyone killing a dictator has to think about how to fill the vacuum and who is going to replace the Führer. So of course, this is something these people are thinking about. And there are moments where, if you will, the right wing of this right wing conjuration is thinking of the Hohenzollerns and saying we somehow can think of the Crown Prince and bringing him back as a symbolic figure for the time after Adolf Hitler. But this fails and it never materializes. And there is even a moment where the Crown Prince himself is prohibiting his son to participate in the conjuration.
Just
So
like
it's
his father.
just like his, yes. So it's not only that they are not participating in it, it's also that they are hampering or hindering this conjuration. They simply do not take any part. So this is one of the most powerful legends that the family was able to create after 45. Like, by the way, a lot of Germans, and particularly a lot of conservative Germans, saying we were never part of it. We try to do what we can, and we somehow are part of the resistance. Of course, the Hohenzollern family knew some of the higher ranking officers, but actively no one of them played an important role in this bomb plot. But it's important to say that the bomb plot, despite Stauffenberg being a Catholic, many, not all of them, but many of the leading men in the bomb plot were part of the most important, or many of the famous Prussian and Northern German families of the nobility, Treschow and Gersdorf and Hardenberg and Schulenburg and Moltke and Bernstorff and what have we not. So they were all there, but the Hohenzollern were not there. And it is despite some of the contacts that Louis Ferdinand, so this would be the grandson of the Kaiser, having certain contacts to the bomb plot, none of them and none of the family really participated in it. And this is, of course, another interesting counterfactual history, which is more for a pub conversation than for historians, but still it's interesting. Had a member of the Hohenzollern family, or had the Kaiser in exile, he's basically living up to summer 1941, issued some kind of an appeal against the Nazis, at a given moment in 33 or in 35 or at the beginning of the war, or when the moments of first information about the concentration camps came out, nothing of this happened. Had it happened, and had the family supported a part of the conservative resistance, it might have probably had a certain effect, and a certain effect on the conservative elites and on the officer corps and on the high-ranking people in the German civil service, for example. This is at least an idea that can be put forward.
That's interesting. Even though a lot of these elites would have known the character makeup of the Kaiser and the Crown Prince, would that not have made it unrealistic? They would have heard this sort of person they didn't particularly respect calling for an end to it. Would that really have influenced them, do you think?
Again, I think there's a difference between what the person is and what the person represents. And for a monarchist, and particularly from a legitimist standpoint, you cannot ignore the people in line. So the Kaiser is in line as long as he lives in 41, and then comes the Crown Prince, and then come his sons. He had many of them. So if these people are still representing the German monarchy, and there is no one else be able to do it. And so I think that despite the personal failures and the unpopularity in parts of the crown prince, he was still representing the idea of the German monarchy and the splendor and the tradition of the Prussian state and the conservative line of history, if you will, the non-Nazi line of right-wing conservative politics, which had become, and I mean, this is how I would read it, and this conservative colleagues see this differently, but for me, it's part of the bankruptcy of German conservatism, because had German conservatism, this is what German conservatism theoretically could have, should have offered to German history or to the German people, is an alternative to the Nazis, even in a symbolic way. And there was no one of the family who even symbolically represented the slightest sign of resistance. And this, I think, is remarkable, especially for the Kaiser who was in exile. Of course, the argument, if you historians close to the family or trying to defend the family would argue, yes, had the Kaiser said something or had someone inside Germany said this, they would immediately have been arrested or been shot. And then, of course, you come up with the examples of Soviet Russia or of the Bolsheviks and the Tsarist family. And the argument would be the Nazis would have been treating the Hohenzollern family as the Bolsheviks had been treating the Tsarist family, who was killed in summer 1918 in Yekaterinburg. But this is made up. The Nazis didn't do anything. They didn't do any harm to the Hohenzollern family, which is remarkable in itself, because if you look at the ruthlessness that the Nazis were using against their enemies, why not killing the entire family, or at least one of them, or two of them? They did not. They never did. Not only they didn't kill them, they were keeping their castles, they were keeping their hats, they were keeping their titles, they were keeping their privileges and their lives. So this is one thing. There is no resistance and there is no real opposition, but these people sink back into a completely unimportant role or unimportant position.
Yes, there's no moral leadership because there's no need for them because they've kept all their possessions. They don't need to provide that moral leadership.
That's right. And I guess that in the other examples, I'm thinking of the King of Denmark. I mean, there are some of the European monarchs who, the same goes for the Netherlands, who in exile represented, the real Netherlands or the real Denmark, or a tradition that was somehow free from the collaborating governments. And in this form, I mean, nobility is always about representation. And even in monarchies like Britain, the king is basically a symbolic figure without real political power. But the symbolic power of these people is remarkable and is important even today. And of course, it would have been important in the 1920s, 30s, 40s, only that there is no production of any kind of symbolical counterpower by the Hohenzollern family. And I think this is the only thing. You cannot ask this family to be social democrat or socialist or be, I don't know, friendly with the communists, but one could have expected this family or any member of the family to represent this kind of symbolic counterpower against the Nazis. And this is, I think, let's say this is a thing that I was surprised to find out, because I have been working about nobility. I did this for 20 years, but I was astonished with the extent to which there was nothing. There was not a single figure, not a single sentence, not a single symbolical gesture, not a single day where this kind of symbolical counterpower would have been produced. And I think this is remarkable.
Yes, that really is, actually. There are sort of slight similarities with their British cousin, the Duke of Windsor, who flirted with Nazism, and actually in some recent publications shows the extent to which he was willing to betray his country in the early days of the war. I suppose if we get to 1945, Stephan, and you have a Germany divided, one half is under the control of the Soviets and the other half is occupied by three Allied powers. Are the Hohenzollerns now on overdrive to sort of cleanse a reputation, or is that difficult to do when Germany is just obviously after the destruction of 1945 at a very low ebb?
Somehow they never came back. And that's another thing which I was surprised with. If you see how popular they were up to, let's say, 1914 or even during the interwar period. But for West Germany after 45, I mean, of course, there were and there still are monarchists in in Germany, but this is a very tiny minority. And also, though the then pretender, if you will, this is the second son of the crown prince, Louis Ferdinand, he was a quite interesting, very cultured, smart, music loving, and he even had a PhD, an intelligent man who somehow did a lot in order to restore the image of the family in the 1950s, 60s, but they never played any important role. Monarchism does not really play any important role in Germany after 45. One of the reasons surely being that the country was so shattered and destroyed that going back to this time was simply, the lines were cut. And of course, for the communist part of Germany, for the GDR, this was unthinkable. And in the communist interpretation of history, monarchism and fascism are basically the same thing. And in their interpretation, the entire nobility was part of fascism, which is a very simplistic way of looking at it because it takes out the tensions and the oppositions between the two. But still, if you will, and I thought this was interesting. So if you are anti-communist in the communist part of Germany after 45, so the non-communists in the GDR, and if they were looking for something to hold on against the regime and against communism, somehow going back to the splendor and going back to the tradition of Prussia and of the monarchy was not completely absurd. And I think this is today in reunified Germany, and Germany is still looking for a new political identity. Going back to the Kaiserreich is not completely absurd, because where do you want to go in German history? Surely not to the Third Reich. The Weimar Republic being more or less excluded if you're a conservative thinker. So somehow the Kaiserreich is the natural place to end up for conservatives if they're looking for positive traditions or ideas to look at. And the book I quoted, I like this in an interview. It's a British author, an English author, Robert Harris, who said in an interview with the Spiegel, and he says, for England, the past is like a warm fire that can warm your hands on a long winter on long winter evenings. And that, of course, in Germany is not impossible. I don't think this is true, but I think in my experience, this is how a lot of British people are looking back at their own past. And Germans can't do this. And you surely cannot look back for the time after 45. So the German quest of a positive history, of brighter traditions, somehow for many people leads back to the Kaiserreich, or perhaps to Frederick the Great that you were mentioning. So you would be in the time around 1800 or in the 18th century. And here again, the Hohenzollern would come back and be figures to identify with. So I don't think that they are entirely gone. And as a positive symbol, they are going to keep on playing a role for at least for the conservative part of the country.
I would have thought if you were looking for, as a German, for a warm, fuzzy time, it would be von Bismarck, who, of course, and you can correct me if I'm wrong here, did he not sideline the monarchy and he became the preeminent figure?
Well, he does, but then of course he is linked to the Kaiserreich, and he is basically the man who creates the Kaiserreich in 1871, and William I being back the Kaiser then. But the link between Bismarck and the Hohenzollern is quite close, despite of the tensions. And I think this comes as the whole shebang comes as an entity. Bismarck, the Kaisers, the army, the victories against France, the modernity of the Kaiserreich. It's an extremely interesting time, and it's a time when, speaking about the Kaiserreich around 1900, who can barely walk from its own force, and thinking that it can challenge the British Empire, the British fleet, and the entire world, which of course in later decades becomes much more unpleasant. And I think this is one thing which, from a British perspective, is always a bit difficult to imagine, how unpleasant it is to look back at German history if you are German, speaking about the 20th century, and that this looking for a positive identification and identification figures. And this goes for left-wing people, for right-wing people, even today. You have to pick you have to make your choice. And I think for the conservative part of the observers, The Kaiserreich, Bismarck, the Hohenzollern family, the nobility is still there, and there is barely an alternative. And it's this kind of symbolic capital that the family can still bank on and will still bank on, I think.
Does
And
that therefore mean that there is, because amongst those groups there was very much the belief in the sort of stab in the back myth in 1918? Is that a sentiment that still runs through these families?
I don't think so. I think that the stab in the back myth is somehow gone, apart from there's surely some neo-Nazis and I think extreme right-wing revisionists, they are believing in it. But I think more importantly, if you think of the extreme success that Christopher Clark's Sleepwalkers had with an interpretation that after all, 1914 was not really Germans' fault or not only Germans' fault, and that things are much more complicated. And with that, at least Christopher Clark, I think I agree with him. So it's form of a friendlier interpretation of 1914, meaning, this seminal catastrophe of the 20th century, the matrix out of which the Nazis, the Second World War, the Holocaust will come out of, was not really Germany's fault, which then again would relativize also the role of William II, of saying there are interpretations. And Christopher Clark had written a biography about William II before, which is a much friendlier image and picture of him, where he is not really knowing where to go and what to do. And in the July crisis in 1914, he says yes and no, and he changes his mind all the time. And the Russians and the Serbs and the French and the British have also their role to play, which is entirely true. So I think I would rather say it's about this. It's a reinterpretation of 1914. It's a reinterpretation of the Kaiserreich. And currently in German historiography, we do have, I would say, the most interesting books. And Christopher Clark has partly triggered this movement, is writing or coming up with interpretations of the German Kaiserreich, which are much, much friendlier than the ones that I have been trained with when I was a student in the 1990s, meaning the Kaiserreich was modern. It was a time of German feminism, of the German social democracy, of industry, of sciences, of German Nobel Prize winners, of interesting architecture, of interesting theater and literature and poetry. All of this is true. Only then this does not really bring us to 1914 and to the reason why the German military and the German government in 1914 did what they did. But it is true. So this is, I think, it's an open story. And I think that reinterpreting the Kaiserreich as an open, interesting, and modern time will also make William II and his father and grandfather put them in a friendlier light than the one we had before.
There's certainly a lot of debate in this country about how we view our past with with the British Empire and all the challenges that comes with. And there are those who think that we shouldn't be doing down our own history. Is it therefore in Germany, who's, as you've just mentioned, has a very troubled past, is it that's a positive that people will be looking at this era leading up to the First World War? Will that have benefits to a country that, a lot of countries, one would argue, it's vital to have a positive view of history?
Well, I mean, this is, of course, a very contested question. And here again,
Yes, I do. Yes.
here again, the German extreme right, so currently the Alternative für Deutschland, AfD, the party in the parliament now running for perhaps 20%, has exactly this kind of discourse. We have been too negative, too dark. There should be a much. The Third Reich is only 12 years of history and 1,000 years of wonderful times we had. I think one thing is that the Third Reich, what it presented to Germany and the destruction of Germany, the destruction of Europe, and the murder of the European Jews is so dark that simply you can't look away from it. And then I personally think that one of the strengths that Germany had developed after 45 was being particularly self-critical, not because Germans learned this so much, but because they were forced to do it, starting with, if you will, the Nuremberg trials and the occupation of the two Germanys, and of somehow really being forced to look at themselves in a very critical ways. other countries, and I've been living in Britain for a long time, I've been living in France for a long time, and I was in the States. So these are three countries which never had been challenged to do that, because this kind of catastrophic defeat that Germany had twice in the 20th century never happened there. So there is, of course, a tendency of unbroken elites, unshattered tradition lines, and of thinking that basically Britain has always walking on the bright side of the street, which might be fine if you look from it from an inner English perspective. If you speak from people in Africa or in India, there are other perspectives. And of course, there are other interpretations of, if you will, the British Empire, for example, not to speak about France or America. So of course, you can somehow challenge any kind of national history in a very critical way. Only that I think Germany was forced to do this. I do personally think it rather benefited from this form than to suffer from it. But of course, German history is fortunately larger and brighter than the Third Reich. Only that, well, as I tried to say, I think this is such a dark point that it will, I think, even in 100 years be impossible to circumvent it and to say, well, this is a detail. Actually, things were nice. They were just this little detour that we were taking on a wonderful way. I think it's impossible.
Yeah, I think so. That is a absolutely fascinating look into a side of German history that actually I was unfamiliar until reading your book. So this has been really brilliant. Thank you, Stephan. And the book, it's out on Thursday, actually, I think, isn't it? So
Yes.
we're speaking on the 28th. So for listeners, there'll be links in the show notes. It's just an extraordinary, fascinating story of this once mighty family. Thank you, Stephan.
Thank you very much for having me. Thank you.
Thank you very much for listening. If you're able to leave a review, and a kind one at that, I'll be overjoyed. But until then, thank you and good night.